Hello, welcome back to episode 5 of the Metacratic podcast. Today we're going to be discussing medical assistance in dying, but before we do that, we'd like to give a quick land acknowledgement.
So, as we are situated within the city of Kingston, Ontario, we want to acknowledge we're on the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat, and we want to thank these nations for their care and stewardship of the land before we came here.
Thanks, Warren. Today we're going to be talking about medical assistance in dying, or MAiD, and specifically whether mental illness should fall into that category. So as a bit of a background, we learned about this in our courses at Queen's University in Kingston previously. We thought that we would revisit it because it is a really complicated topic. So in 2015, there was a big legislative change in the Supreme Court that allowed for medical assistance in dying to be accepted in order to satisfy the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And there have been a lot of updates to that. But in 2021, they specifically added a section of the legislation saying mental illness would not be considered until revisions in 2023. That struck a little bit of controversy, as mental illness does have a lot of stigma surrounding it, but it's still not applicable for medical assistance in dying. So we thought that we would talk about some aspects of it. So do you guys have any ideas of what types of mental illnesses should or shouldn't be accepted under MAiD?
Before we talk about that, do we want to specify exactly how MAiD works in Canada?
Yeah, we can do that.
Does anyone have any information about how the process starts?
Well, I think the process starts by it used to be that you needed to have death for a foreseeable future. So if you were going to die eventually, they removed that recently, so last year. So I think it's just any intense suffering that is accepted. And you need a few criteria, I believe, as well. So it needs to be completely your decision. I think that's the most important one. There was a few more, but I can't think of it.
Was there the one without a mental illness? Was that? I think that was in the criteria.
There was, yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure if this is for mental illness in particular, but I believe that you needed to have acknowledgement by numerous physicians as to the condition that you are in to be put up for review under MAiD. As to my knowledge, at least on the topic.
So just to give some background on these criteria to actually be eligible for MAiD, right now in Canada, if you want to apply for this program, you first have to be an eligible individual to receive health services in Canada. So you actually have to be a resident that has received health services from Health Canada or the government. Furthermore, you have to be 18 years old in order to give consent for this procedure, and therefore you have to be mentally competent. So you have to make healthcare decisions for yourself, and especially they have to be done voluntarily without outside pressures. As well as what Stefan said here, you have to have a grievous or irremediable medical condition, something that would be either lifelong or be terminal in nature. And you have to give your informed consent to actually have this procedure done, which can be a problem in the case of mental illnesses, because how do you define consent in those cases?
Yeah, so I mean, the actual eligibility criteria, right? Like you said, you need to be 18 years old, or you need to be able to have informed consent. But one of the interesting one that's written in the actual new law that was updated in 2021 is have enduring and intolerable physical or psychological suffering that cannot be alleviated under conditions the person considers acceptable. So they specifically specified psychological suffering or physical, right? So by that logic, it kind of seems like they're insinuating that mental illness should be. Right?
I think it's interesting that they also bring up the fact that it is up to the individual's decision as to if current treatment for their condition is considered acceptable by the person that is applying for MAiD, which I think is very unique because it needs to show that the person is not only competent in understanding their own situation, but also understanding the condition that they're being diagnosed with through whatever medical care that they've received. And I'm not sure if there's anything on this, but I think that also includes that they've attempted various remedies to their condition, right? So, and that they've deemed them inadequate in solving such a condition.
Yeah, and that's the problem with a lot of mental illnesses, right? You can't really
Exactly.
cure them, and that's kind of the same idea with things such as chronic pain,
where there are potential solutions,
yeah,
right? But it may not be acceptable by the person that is undergoing such medications. For example, chronic pain medications, while they may be good for some individuals, they might not be deemed acceptable by others. So it's interesting that they bring up that point that the individual is making the choice, the acceptability of treatment.
I think it's interesting that you talk about acceptability of treatment. I think, Rita, you actually know some information about how they can choose to go along. Do they need to know treatments, and do they have to try? Do you know anything about that?
They have to know the available form of treatment, and they have to go through all the options that are available, and then after that, give informed consent as they receive.
That is actually really interesting, because now not only with mental illness patients, but okay, so for example, let's say you have a really chronic condition where you're in a lot of pain, right? Now, interventions for pain management could vary drastically between pharmaceuticals or even potentially surgical interventions, depending on what it is, right? So by referring to gone through all the options, does that mean that they have to actually commit to the procedures that are available for every case? Or do you think that it's just a review of potential options, and if none of them seem acceptable by the patient, that they'd be given the opportunity for me?
Well, you just receive all the information about it, about all the available treatments and options that would relieve the suffering. So I feel like you have the option to either choose to receive the treatment or not.
Right. And when it comes to mental illness, a lot of these interventions, they can be pharmaceutical, but they can also be through counseling, right? So seeing experts in the field of whatever you're suffering with and trying to remedy this condition. And I think that this is where a large amount of stigmatism comes around mental health, where getting people to seek out assistance, especially regarding conditions like this, or regarding conditions around mental health, is a big step in potentially deterring people from this program. I think that's a very important thing to bring up, and why they included that as a rule set is it's important for patients that are undergoing chronic pain, whether it be physical or mental, to experience all possible treatments that are available with today's technology and that are always being developed, because there's always new things coming up in medicine, to see that this really is their only option.
So I would say, I would actually disagree. And only because I think if a patient has to actually experience treatment, that can be quite dangerous for them, even if they have a condition.
That's what I was actually wondering, right? Because some treatments, do you have to go through them, right?
So
you just need to.
What Rhea was saying was that you don't actually have to do the treatments. You don't have to wear. You just need to be informed of them and understand the implications. Because in some cases, if you try a treatment, even if it is mental illness, you can have so many side effects that would just make your condition worse or give you another thing.
And you don't want to go through it. You don't want to increase suffering on the patient's side, right?
Exactly.
But it's important to recognize that while, and this is where I find it interesting because it's based off of the patient's assessment of the treatment. What if the treatment that they've been informed about would have worked, but they decide to decline attempts on it, right? And instead pursue MAiD. So I think that could raise some issues related to mental assistance, mental illness, and those seeking MAiD. I don't know if you have anything to say on that one.
I think at that point, I mean, you're dealing with hypotheticals, right? Anything could have helped, anything could have, but we don't know until we try. And at the end of the day, because we're in Canada and consent to different medical interventions is ultimately up to the patient, it's not really important for qualifications, I believe, because if they don't want to do it, it doesn't really matter if they move out, because what if they don't?
I mean, it's a really hard topic, obviously, to talk about, but I think we're kind of thinking of mental illness as like anxiety and depression. Like I think that's the kind of way that we've been generalizing it right now. But there's also a lot of different types of mental illnesses that can cause physical pain, right? Like there's ones that cause intolerable suffering. And I think that a lot of people who actually apply to MAiD, because we saw a few examples of this, was a condition that wasn't rooted in a physical cause, but was rooted in a psychological cause, but caused the same symptoms. So like chronic pain. So these people, the only difference between what they're experiencing is the source of the suffering. And they are ineligible for MAiD because of that. And so I think that grouping, and this is like my opinion, grouping an entire category of what can be accepted into MAiD, so mental illness versus physical illness, should not be the way that the legislation actually runs. Obviously, it's a case-by-case basis, but immediately removing anyone that suffers from mental illness to be eligible for MAiD just doesn't seem like it satisfies any, like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, like at all, right? Because I know that they say like somewhere that any individual with any physical or mental disability should be treated with the same respect, dignity, and consideration, right? But it doesn't seem like that's being upheld. That's what I think.
I find that very interesting that you bring up, because we've been taught, at least in many of our courses here, that whenever we're referring to drugs and treatments, that we always say in most cases. We never say in all cases. So I find it very interesting that legislation around MAiD is being based around absolutes, where at least in the current medical, or at least in the current educational system surrounding drugs and pharmaceuticals, we always consider the fact that there are cases abnormal from what would be expected. And especially for MAiD, we should totally be accepting of those very rare cases, and there will be rare cases where that just do not conform to the rules that we've already established, and there should be an exception to that rule, at least for even applying, because I believe that it's a process. And that when you're given a situation such as these mental illnesses that cause physical pain, but to be immediately discarded and ineligible to even apply to this program, that is undoubtedly represents an inequality in care.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a huge problem with just like the diagnosis of it, because the way that the legislation, I don't know how it exactly works, but I would assume that it works like not absolute, like we said, but like this person has this illness, which can be under MAiD, this person has this illness, which cannot be under MAiD. But the fact of the matter with mental illness is a lot of the times it's extremely difficult to diagnose. We don't even have a standard criteria of diagnosing. Like we use the DSM, but that's not, I don't think that's like a really one size fits all approach to diagnosing things. So making a case more case by case is obviously a lot more work, but it makes more sense. It's not absolute, I think now, like you can still apply, but it's absolute in the sense that if it's a mental illness and it's quite noticeable, it will get rejected, which has happened in a lot of situations. So
the case study that we did in our class was about Adam Mayer Clayton's mental illness that involved severe physical pain. He explains it as it feels like burning acid. And if I remember correctly, he ended up not receiving permission to
he didn't get paid.
Do MAiD, and did he?
He committed suicide.
He committed suicide.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's something important to remember, right? For these people who don't qualify, they might turn.
And that's also a huge stigma, right? Around like not only mental illness but suicide as well. And so that's why a lot of them, I think, go for that path of MAiD, because it's kind of more like official, right? And
I mean, for MAiD being official and a long-term process, it not only allows you to think it out for you, but I remember what we used to talk about in class was the effect of MAiD as opposed to suicide on the family. Because for MAiD, you do have that time period where you can talk it out with your loved ones, with your friends, with your family. But for suicide, it just happens, right? And then sometimes people will just discover their loved ones who did it, and it will hit them that much harder.
I think it's very important that you bring that up as well, because by going through the MAiD process, I think that it helps to isolate some feelings through individuals and ensure that this is the path that they want to take.
I agree.
Because in many situations, I can't relate from personal experience, but I am sure that seeking out assistance in understanding what exactly MAiD entitles and why you should be seeking it out is an important thing that everyone should consider when you're under such extreme pain or under such conditions that you may not personally be seeing the right picture at that time, and that you haven't considered everything. And that by pursuing an option like this, you might bring it up with family, you might bring it up with friends, and then at the centers, I think it's also important that, and I believe that this is probably what they go through, but that they're emphasizing the importance of the person's choice in this matter, and that they should be still being proactive in trying to prevent, despite what conditions they're going through. And I think that's very important, going back to the initials, with going back to what we were talking about earlier with the acknowledgement of what's going to happen during MAiD, and receiving all possible treatments and learning about all the possible or all available things that you can do to prevent your pain. I think it's very important to bring up for all patients that might be in this situation and be considering this alternative. And it should be considered a last resort, obviously. But it's a last resort that is superior to suicide, in my opinion, because of what Warren brought up. You're able to talk this through, you're able to consolidate loved ones and express your reason for going through this procedure and not just simply unexpectedly taking one's life.
I agree.
Also, with regards to mental illnesses, because mental illnesses often can go unchecked in individuals, you might be isolated for extended periods of time, and without services such as MAiD, you may never actually seek the support that you can get or proper treatments that are available, and simply take I wouldn't say an easier way out of your pain, but a more blinded approach to eliminating the current pain in your life, instead of seeking professional assistance that you would see in MAiD applications and the process required to apply.
Yeah, it should definitely be a really rigorous process.
Yeah.
And it does,
But not too rigorous, right?
No, I think
Because we still want to be acceptable of people's.
When we talk about the process, right, unfortunately, we do have to set parameters for what is eligible and what is not. And with mental illness, that is a very subjective thing. So, can anyone think of any eligibility requirements that might fit in the case of mental illness if we had, or we are instating that, to be correct? But if
reconsidering it.
Reconsidering. Oh, so if it were to be instated, can anyone think of any requirements
This is one that might be a little controversial. And I'm going to bring up the topic of PTSD. Now, I would personally not consider PTSD as an eligible mental illness for MAiD. However, based off of stigmas that I have learned about, and many horrifying war stories of veterans returning and having PTSD episodes, we could say, where they are clearly mentally disturbed in one way or another. If you had someone applying with PTSD, do you think that that would be an eligible requirement for MAiD, seeing that it might not be causing physical pain, but it might be causing emotional, or as we would say, this would not technically be classified as physical pain, but it would be mental
It doesn't
well-being,
have to be physical
right?
pain. It can be psychological suffering.
Right.
That's one of the criteria for MAiD now. So we just don't consider mental illnesses, but psychological suffering is something that can be considered under MAiD. And they have to have a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability. So if the PTSD is... So I assume that in order to diagnose this, they would have to talk to a psychologist or a therapist, like a qualified individual who can determine that. And that's the way that they actually do it with physical illnesses now for MAiD, right? They have a person that assesses their condition and determines whether they're eligible or not for MAiD in their opinion. And that's a case-by-case basis. And I believe that these jobs require a lot of training, and they have that set in place already. So switching that over to a psychological perspective, in my opinion, should be harder, obviously, because mental illness is a bit more harder to diagnose, but you have so many qualified therapists and psychologists who can determine what state a person is in, because they deal with these people all the time, right? And they can figure out at what stage they are in PTSD, for example, or, you know, any other mental illness, and if they think that it's big enough, then they might be able to say that they're eligible for MAiD, in their opinion.
I agree with that. I think you would have to have some diagnosis of severity in order to be eligible. Now, I'm actually curious at hearing what you think about this, Ryu, because you are an international student from Japan, right? So what would you think on eligibility for mental illness, or what kind of severities should be used for MAiD?
So in Japan, there is no such thing as MAiD or euthanasia in any form. Well, and first when I came to Canada and heard about MAiD, and also that they're considering mental illnesses as a criteria to be able to go through with MAiD, I was really shocked, and it was shocking for sure. Surprising, yeah, unexpected, yeah, because in Japan, mental illnesses is still and not under-discovered, but under-appreciated? Stigmatized. And definitely not very, not considered important.
Okay.
So, but
yeah,
after doing the course and learning about how mental illnesses can affect, you know, physical pain, like emotionally, and putting suicide and MAiD on like a
pedestal.
when comparing them, I feel like MAiD is a better option,
or at least a better process to go through.
Yeah,
with the same conclusion, essentially. Yeah. Right. I'm also here's a question. What are suicide rates like in Japan? Have you looked into that?
It's very high, one of the highest in the world.
So that's what I remember reading on some articles, right? So do you, just in your opinion, do you think that if MAiD was accepted in Japan, hypothetically, could it have an influence on your suicide rate?
I feel like it...
Or do you think that the stigmatization around mental illness and potentially its correlative effects on suicide rates would prevent residents from seeking out MAiD services for mental illnesses? Not particularly for physical ones, because I'm sure that there are, well, maybe not, but there might be more cases for physical illnesses to seek out MAiD in Japan. But specifically mental illness, especially since there's so much stigma around it in other parts of the world compared to Canada, where we're trying to learn more about it and accept mental illnesses and talk about mental illness. Specifically in Japan, this might not actually have the same influence that we would see here in Western cultures.
In my opinion, I think, well, there would be a big lineup for MAiD if it was made available for mental illnesses, and I feel like there would be a lot of backlash as well from the older generation, which have stronger stigmatizations towards mental health, mental illnesses and mental health. And I'm not very sure if the suicide rate overall would go down or up, but it would definitely be a difficult process because there's not even MAiD or anything close to that, even for physical conditions like terminal cancer and stuff.
So I think if it was accepted for physical conditions, that seems more reasonable, like based off of the climate right now. Like if that was accepted, it would be controversial to an extent, like any major political decision, but it seems like it would be possible because like that's easy to understand, like someone who has like
Yes.
terminal cancer, like stage 4 something, right? But for mental illness, there's just such a stigmatization around it in a lot of countries, including Japan, and I don't think it's really a fair comparison, right? To kind of say like, what would you do if you were to just add it? Because it just wouldn't happen.
You just don't
right?
see it happen.
Maybe in 100 years or so, or
Yeah.
50 years, or 20 years, if they actually became more open to the idea of mental illness, then it would be added. Because we didn't discuss this. This wasn't an option in 2015 in Canada.
Right.
It became an idea in
It's only been recent.
2021, an idea that's still not accepted, right, at all. So it's
It's
difficult to compare.
Only recently in Western culture have we even considered mental illness as a significant issue, right? I remember back in elementary school, this was just starting to appear in just kind of the social media around me, where and even like Bell Let's Talk. This has been something that has only been happening for the past like decade, and only now have we been really trying to emphasize the true nature of mental illnesses and how they affect people more publicly, because for the longest time these things have been ignored, to say the least. They've been rejected as potential medical conditions and really only brought up as psychological issues of the individual that are completely solvable in all cases. Like, it's just in your head was the old stigma around it. But now we're only learning, we're just, I would say that the public at least just glancing the surface as to how deep the mental illness rabbit hole actually goes. And especially when we're dealing with the brain, right? It really can go down quite a ways.
So I think that's interesting, but I really want to bring it back here, and I want to specify something that we're talking about. So I find the most interesting thing to do with MAiD and mental illness is the problem of consent, because that's all that MAiD is built on. You have to give written consent when the process starts. You have to have a review by 2 independent physicians, I believe.
Yeah.
And even before you actually have the procedure done, you have to give consent right then and there.
And
Now, the problem with mental illness, how do you quantify consent in these cases? Because in some cases, mental illness, it's fine. You are fully capable of giving consent. But in other cases, you might not be able to do so. And how do we qualify? How do we
So
decide?
if you can't do that, then in my opinion, you are not eligible. Because
So how would you decide in the case of a mental illness specifically
whether
is
someone is eligible or
so?
not? Oh, okay.
If they can give consent or not.
So, well, I mean, you can go, obviously it's a spectrum, but you can go to 2 completely polarized points, right? A mental illness that causes physical, like, intolerable suffering is not really different from some physical illness that
causing
also
the same
causes
suffering.
the same intolerable suffering. So at that point, you could say it's the same. But when you have maybe something that is much more difficult to assess, like the cognizance of some person, like how conscious they actually are, maybe something like serious, like schizophrenia or something, right? Like this random thing that I pulled out, right? That might be really difficult, but that's why you have the 2 independent physicians. So personally, I don't know what they actually assess, but I feel like it's a difficult topic to even consider, like whether this person is really doing what they think is best for them, even in a physical illness perspective. Because when you're dealing with a physical illness, there's also like dropovers into the psychological realm. Because if you're suffering from intolerable pain for 5-10 years and you want to be eligible for MAiD, there's a high chance that you will have depression, you will have anxiety, you will have psychological suffering as well that may make you technically ineligible for MAiD. So being able, for 2 physicians or however many they actually look at, being able to discern whether the consent that you're giving is actually informed is really difficult, but obviously they know what they're doing to an extent, I would say. So I don't really see too much of a difference between mental illness and physical illness in that sense.
What would be the case if someone can't consent? Because I know I actually looked this up recently. In the case of dementia, especially late-stage dementia, which both is mental and physical, because of the degeneration of the brain, in some cases they actually may not be able to give consent for MAiD.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting idea, because what happens in that case?
So usually when you're considering medical treatments for someone who has extreme dementia or Alzheimer's, usually you have a family member, like a spouse or sibling, who makes medical decisions for you. Now that brings up a question. Obviously you can say, I want to give them this treatment because this is what the doctor recommends, but recommending death is a little bit different, because you are ending this person's life, even though you are the person that's acting as their, what was the word?
Guardian.
Guardian. There's a
specific term.
So the person that's making the decisions for them, like that term, how are you going to justify ending their life? How do you justify their suffering to an extent that that's warranted? Can you follow the same criteria as MAiD, saying this person has... But also at the same time, when you're considering something like dementia, it's usually not the person themselves that's suffering a lot, right?
Also the family.
The family members are, a lot of the time, the major people affected.
Taking the burden of business.
Yeah.
I mean, personally, this is just from my own experience with dementia and things with it. I wouldn't feel comfortable with an end-stage dementia patient providing consent, simply because in some cases they may not know what they're doing, and they might not even know where they are or who they are. But for me, I would also have a problem with a caretaker, or I forget the specific term of the person who can give consent in their stead, with them doing the exact same procedures. I think there should be some extra qualifications or some reasoning that they have to provide in order to actually qualify for this. What do you guys think?
It's substitute decision maker.
Substitute
That was
decision.
the term. I mean, that's also a really difficult topic too. I mean, usually if you're deemed to be a substitute decision maker, it's very difficult, because then at that point, I feel like the physician would have to assess the substitute decision maker's plans, right? Because there are some people that might have ill intent.
Like in the case of if they've written a will.
Yeah, right. That would be a situation where it's difficult to consider whether they would actually make the proper informed decision or not. So I feel like in those situations, you would have to really go past what's in the legislation now, kind of really blur the lines to figure out what is actually ethical in that situation.
I feel like including dementia, where it's a blurry line, right? In terms of physical suffering and mental suffering, I feel like they shouldn't allow kind of blurry lines. In terms of,
I agree with you.
It should be a bit more clear.
I agree with you, Ryu, because when you're talking about conditions like dementia, you are bringing about the idea that the person is potentially no longer capable of giving their own consent. And consent, as Warren has already said, is a very important part of the MAiD process. And unless the patient is suffering from multiple comorbidities, so dementia in pair with some physical illness that existed prior to the development of such a disease, I believe that if you are only suffering from dementia, I personally do not think, if you're suffering from dementia and you're unable to give consent because you don't understand what actually is going on, you're not able to understand the condition that you are suffering from and the potential solutions to that disease, then you shouldn't be applicable for MAiD, and instead you should be searching for other solutions outside of MAiD. For example, caring for this, like looking for external supports outside of the person's family own, like their own care, potentially moving this person into seniors home or somewhere to support them in
To
an
bring it back to
environment.
mental illness, then would you also say the same thing for people with significant mental illnesses that affect their consent?
I would say that if the mental illness affects the person's understanding of their situation that they're in, so they cannot actually comprehend what is happening to their body, then they shouldn't be.
I still
I don't want to say
think
that they
they're
don't want to be eligible, but I would highly disapprove of seeking MAiD out as a primary source of or primary solution. This should be again, I'm talking about this being the last resort. It really should be the last resort for these patients because there are so many things that could be sought out to accommodate these people in our society. We have care homes. We have places that people with dementia can be put to live.
We kind of talked about that a little because
respectfully.
one of the criteria of MAiD is absolutely no treatment available. Right? So whatever they consider, they don't want to go for it. So that would be the only situation where you would even consider MAiD is whether this person does not want to go into a care home, they don't want to receive treatment, they don't want to receive therapy. And I think that the whole issue that we've been talking about with dementia and different disorders, when we're talking about whether this person is actually informed enough to make a decision, we have therapists and people that understand behavior that are professionals in these situations, who can really confidently determine whether this person is acting out of their own volition or whether their mental illness is completely corrupting their sense of self, right? So as long as you have those physicians who can actually determine that, trained professionals in an environment such as Canada, it might not be a worldwide thing, but Canada's a pretty small healthcare environment in general compared to the rest of the world. So being able to have that system in place, I think makes MAiD for mental illness much more feasible than we think.
I agree. I definitely think we have professionals who can help with this process, who should be recruited in order to put those systems in place. Now, I see we're running a little bit long here, so does anyone want to do a little final recap of what we discussed today and any final notes for people to take with them so they can do some of their own research?
Yeah, so, first we talked about just generally what MAiD is.
And the process
of
going through
what it is, what you need to be eligible, and we kind of, throughout the episode, we kind of touched on what it means for physical illnesses. But the main kind of thing that we came out of this was whether or not MAiD should be available for people with mental illnesses, and we went through a bunch of different types of mental illness. So we talked about the case study of Adam, who had the intense physical suffering. We talked about dementia, and we talked about ways that MAiD could be implemented into people that have mental illness. So, having people who can deem whether they give informed consent or not. And I guess for me personally, I would say that MAiD should be allowed for mental illness, but through all the points that we talked about, right? But I think it's really important for everyone listening to come up with your own decision based off of the research that you do. A lot of people have, it's a very split decision, I think. It's definitely probably close to 50-50 in our generation, I would say.
I think that also, when you're listening to this, it's very important to bring up topics of not only articles or research that you may have read, but also to pull on some anecdotal evidence, because there's always a little bit that there's only so much that you can read in research, and sometimes it's important to touch on your personal experiences with mental health, personal experiences with anyone that's been going through something like this. I know that there are strong opinions that exist surrounding mental illness where you should be doing everything you can to keep this person around. All right. There's really no other losing this person shouldn't be even an option. But there are cases that we've discussed in this podcast that really bring yourself to question if this person deserves to follow through with their choice and their ability to, I guess, live the life to the end that they want.
At the end of the day, we really want to encourage everyone to do some of their own research, whether it be online, talking to friends, looking up anecdotes. I would really encourage any listeners out there to at least look at the Government of Canada's website about MAiD. And if anyone out there is suffering from a mental illness or depression, please make sure to reach out to your friends, your family, peer support services. There are always someone there who can help you.
Also, I would recommend looking at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's where I got a lot of my ideas for why MAiD should or shouldn't be accepted in certain situations. It really kind of gives you an idea of what people think is how you can actually separate those kind of blurry lines in ethical situations. It gives you a lot of ideas of how Canada actually bases its legislation.
I think that's a really good resource. And with that, I think we all want to thank anyone out there for listening to our 5th episode of the Metacratic Podcast. Have a good night, everyone.
Or morning or afternoon or whatever.